I want to encourage you to be very selfish. Selfish, I mean, think about what you're trying to get out of this and be very clear on it, yeah? Try to be really clear on what matters for you, what matters for your organization, for your brand, for, what you're trying to achieve. Because when we're talking about the skill sets and the area of crisis management, it's very different across the board. I think FMCGs versus NGOs, they're very different things, yeah? So as much as possible, don't get too caught up in like the whole field. Try to focus more on what matters to you. And don't feel bad about being selfish. I want you guys to be selfish. Second thing is try to be honest. Don't sugarcoat. Yeah, for as much as possible, don't sugarcoat. Just find ways to be very clear and honest about the feedback that you get and the things that you hear and the concepts that come up, just so that, we can have a nice friendly conversation over here about the things I'm about to bring up. I'm going to be talking about values. Before I get into that, there's going to be someone who will talk more in detail about what crisis is and what crisis management is. I want to kind of just give you the 3 key things that kind of make a crisis, right? First thing is, it has potential negative impact. So the minute that potential negative impact exists, you're 1/3 of the way there. Next thing is it has a short decision time. So it happens and you have a very quick time that you need to respond. And then the third one is the element of surprise. It's one of those things that you haven't really planned for, but when it happens, you now have to deal with it, right? So this is one of the things that requires, the agility, and it basically forces people to come into rooms like this so you can try to plan ahead for it. And generally, the impact of that is a lot of loss. Right? We tend to have a lot of reputational loss, monetary loss. If you're someone like me who ends up getting the call in the middle of the night, sleep loss. But ultimately what you're losing is value in one way or another. And when I say value, it's twofold. First is whatever is precious to you, whatever has value to you, whether you're talking about the monetary gains or whatever, or you're talking about the equity that you have with your audience, or you're talking about opportunities that existed that have now been lost, or the investment that you've put down over time to try not to get bogged down. All those things get lost in that moment of crisis in one way or another. Crisis management has many definitions. I'll give you mine, or the one that works best for my presentation, which is essentially that you're trying to implement strategies that help minimize how much value you lose and maximize how much value you gain. That's basically what we're trying to do, right? At the point at which crisis shows up. And I say at the point it shows up, not if, but when, because it will, one way or another. And I think the way the world is moving, we're kind of spiraling closer and closer to the center of a tornado where at some point we're all going to be firefighting nonstop. So it's important to kind of make sure that those strategies are in place so they can be implemented so that you can minimize the value that you lose, maximize the value that you gain. I want to focus instead on this idea of value and how you can maximize it. Now, there are 3 phases generally in crisis management. Depending on which school you went to, you might have been taught the 5 or the 7 or the 10, but 3 key phases: the preparedness, what you do beforehand, the response, and the recovery. Some people add extra things in between. So you have, between preparedness and response, there's usually a point there where I think it's about the communication, the strategy. Sometimes you have evaluation as a step. There's a lot of different things that kind of get added in between, but 3 key phases: before, during, and after, right? What I want us to kind of look at is just how each one of the things that I'm going to be talking about can be applied to each one of those phases. Because there is an opportunity to be able to kind of apply each insight to each one of these phases. And I'll come back to that at the end. So please remember this guy over here. This is where I'm going to yay nay you guys. Yeah, I'm going to share some things that I think are obvious and that help move this presentation along a little bit quicker. If you agree, when I lift my hand up, you say yay, and when I lift this other hand up, you say nay if you disagree. If you don't disagree, if you don't agree. Okay, we're good? All right, first one up. A crisis avoided is better than a well-managed crisis. Yay or nay? Yay. Does anyone have a nay? Okay, cool, because those are the people I wouldn't talk to after this. So the main idea here is that in general, you would prefer preparation over cure, right? I watched a video about crisis management, and the guy said that if you had a choice between being bulletproof and never being shot, which one do you choose? Never being shot, right? Because being bulletproof doesn't really guarantee you anything. It just means you will be shot at some point. Yeah. So if you can't guarantee this attack will never happen, it's way better than you guarantee my ability to survive if it does. And the idea there, I think, for most of us is that whatever we're thinking about, let's start with the preventative measures. We know the worst can happen down the road. And the challenge that we have is in confusing what preparing is and what planning is. Because preparing, meaning like making sure that these situations never become a thing, is very different from planning for it. When I was saying preparing versus planning, what tends to happen quite a lot is if you think about, say, how you prepare for any other disaster, right? You look at what the outcomes could be, what's the worst that could happen, and then you prepare for that outcome. So for instance, if we're planning on electricity being out, and we said, okay, you know what we need is we need generators, let's buy a few of those, et cetera, right? Then that's preparing for the outcome that we don't have power later on. However, if you're planning for it, what tends to happen is that you start looking at it like, okay, cool. Then since this is going to happen, this is what we're going to do. And you spend time, instead of putting in place systems and measures and actions that you can take now, trying to get whatever you can get done before the power goes out. And that tends to be how people respond to this, because one option requires investment in time, money, effort. The other one doesn't. Saying let's get as much done before things go sideways is a lot easier than let's budget for a generator. For most people, especially in finance. I hope there are no finance people. Oh, hi, Karia. But especially like finance, procurement, the enemies of marketing. That's not what we call you, by the way. That's what we call them. But for those people, that tends to be the easiest way to look at it. What can we do to minimize our current output and save that money for later? Yeah. Okay, second one. It is impossible to care about everything. Yay, nay? Yay? Yay. Nay? Okay, good. Those are the ones I was going to avoid for lunch. So this is also true. Like, I think you have to be selective about where your values lie and where your interests lie and the things that you respond to. When crisis happens, sometimes you will sit there and go, is this really a problem, or is this just something that has a platform right now? If someone writes to you and they say, I opened a bottle of your soda and it had a piece of plastic in it and blah, 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 and that tweet gets 100,000 retweets. Okay, let's figure out what the problem with the quality is. But if someone writes and they say, I don't like how the taste has changed over time, and that tweet gets a lot of retweets, and you think the taste hasn't changed, nothing has happened, then finding the energy to care about it is just not there, right? So ultimately, how you make that decision about where you put that emotional weight really depends, because if you make it based on how many retweets and how many people are talking about this, you might find yourself reacting to something that you have no business reacting to. You might put value in something that has no value to you. And the minute you do that, the minute you shift that goalpost, that's now your permanent goalpost. Now you have to focus on that thing forever, because if someone else comes there and you reacted to one, but you don't react to the next one, you now have to care about something you didn't care about. Third one. I made a video about this for the people who watched it, leakage, but silence is not a strategy, but sometimes it works. Yay, nay? Yay? I can see the silent people. And nay? Good. I agree on this one, very much so, because silence has been the thing that I think a lot of brands default to. And it's kind of how a lot of crisis comms have been built, is that you prepare and then you find a way to just like weather the storm and wait it out. But a few things are changing, and this is why this presentation is here today. A few things are changing that are making it harder and harder to stay silent when these things hit, when these crises come up. There are two primary ones, and that's what the little foreshadowing is there. By the way, anyone who knows subtle foreshadowing, I tried to do the video effect, it didn't work. But evolution and revolution. I'm going to touch on each one of these You can kind of guess based on Zuckerberg and Mwangi down there. But there are two big changes that have made it very difficult to be able to just sit and weather a storm without doing anything. Let me start with a small timeline. I say a small timeline. Let me just preface this by this is a big slide. In the beginning, there was light, but after light, there was a social network that was created. Very early on, social media was specifically that. It was social media. It was a space for you to go and connect with people and share things with people. Yeah, that was the main purpose of it. It was not profitable. I think anyone in tech remembers there was a period of time where like social networks were just sinkholes for money that had a lot of people in them, but they didn't have a business model, right? And then something happened. Every time there's an audience, people like us go and convince our clients to go where that audience is. So brands decided they wanted to go there and they wanted to create content there. And if you look at the evolution of any social network or any content platform right now, the inflection point happened when brands shifted there. Because the minute the brands shifted there, the platforms realized, I'm not a social network, I'm an advertising network. But before they realized that, first, the brands also realized something. What they realized is that we now have a new way to engage with our audience, right? By the way, this is like a crash course of Web 2.0 and 3.0 being compressed into 5 minutes. But basically they realized we have an audience, we have a way to directly communicate with that audience, and a lot of things changed internally. And that's where brands started building themselves up as individuals, like personification. And by personification, I don't mean creating personas. Just seen all the strategists in the room just collectively shudder. But personification in terms of behaving like a person, receiving messages and replying to them, commenting under videos, doing things like they were people when they're not. On the flip side, when brands got involved, consumers also realized they now have direct access. So if you're part of those early Twitter people, you remember when we started harassing Safaricom until their customer care became Twitter. Yeah, anybody from Safaricom, I am sorry for the trauma I have brought up on you. In fact, I don't know where Naomi is. That one she would have laughed. Anyway, but what happened is there started becoming this expectation that you should be here and you should listen to me and you should behave like this. The expectation was set the minute you decided to behave like a person. Before that, if you're old enough to remember, before that, engaging with brands was completely different. That direct access changed a lot of things about what we expect from them. It changed a lot of things about how we connect with them. Good and bad, because it's not just about the customer care, right? They will put up Happy Mashujaa Day. What's today's holiday called? Happy whatever the hell day. They will put that up as a thing, right? They will mention it there, and then you have to now look at them the same way you look at other people. That didn't exist before. It was a newspaper ad that you skipped over very quickly. If anybody ever read those public holiday newspaper ads, I don't know what you're doing with a newspaper, but that's not what newspapers are for. Anyway, the idea is that these things happened and changed, and people started having to engage with them very differently on the brand side and on the creator side. But like I said, there was the business that came up. And the platforms basically realized this is where the gold mine is, and very quickly changed their model. And in the beginning, and it's important to kind of know this, in the beginning it was mostly about amplifying the content and targeting people. What they were monetizing was the fact that I know all these details about you, I can help you reach your audience, right? So you want to push this message about, I don't know, medicine for young kids, I can help you find parents. You want to push this fitness program for people who are slightly soft in the middle, I can help you find people who've been searching for that, right? So it was about amplifying and targeting in the very, very beginning. And that model worked for a little while, but then as greed goes, when you have a lot of money, the next thing you want is even more money. So they started trying to figure out how to do it. And this is where they came across two things. First thing that happened is that they realized that culture, politics, social movements have a lot more money than brands. This is something that you might not be clued in on if you're not part of the business end of a social network. But the profitability of politics is a massive turning point for social networks. What you saw happening with Cambridge Analytica, what we saw happening with elections pretty much worldwide, is a huge inflection point in terms of the business model for social networks. Not just Meta, pretty much all of them across the board. Because very, very quickly YouTube realized, yes, there's sports and music, but news is huge for them. Same thing with Meta. They realized, like, if you look at Kenya right now, the number of Kenyans with over 5 million followers that are not politicians, very few. Majority of the audience is drawn there. So they started trying to monetize that. And we kind of know what that led to in terms of, I mentioned Cambridge Analytica, so you can kind of see the foreshadowing there. It went pretty badly because, you meddle with people's lives and people's governments, people start holding you to account. So the next thing they started trying to figure out is, what about it works so that we can replicate it? This is where the algorithm kicked in, and the algorithm says it's not the politics per se, but that tension it creates, the conflict. When you think about the way there's that crazy uncle or aunt on Facebook who says these things that are outlandish, that's intentional. Because if you talk to that uncle or aunt, they will say, I have this crazy nephew or niece. That polarization was created intentionally to put you on both sides of the spectrum so that you react to each other, right? Because that reaction, believe it or not, is the reason why some of us are still on Facebook. It's not the positive feeling, it's the negative reaction that you get where you go in and you want to correct something. That's your impetus. You might not think that. You might be thinking, oh, let me go check birthdays. But then as you're checking that birthday and then you see someone write something and it's like slightly sexist and you want to be like, and then you try to correct that with a hit of dopamine and you get a small hit and then you get another big negative hit and then you try to correct that and you keep scrolling. Eventually you find you spent an hour and you don't remember whose birthday it was. That's a thing that the algorithm figured out very early on. Creating that conflict, creating that tension has a lot more value than anything else. And here's the thing, right? That's when the business model shifted from promoting and targeting to attention. Can we keep you here for as long as possible? One of the key things you'll notice if you look at like metrics for social over time is that even when the number of users doesn't increase, the amount of time does. Right? If you look at TikTok, okay, TikTok is a bit of a strange one because it's also the number of users have increased, but the amount of time is, no, TikTok people aren't here. Unfortunately, there was a massive layoff at TikTok. Anyway, but if you look at the amount of time people spend on TikTok, it has gone up so significantly. In the beginning, we're talking about, Kenyans spend on average 3 hours a day. I think now we are leading the world in hours per day on TikTok. Yeah. Right? And it's one of those things where you tell Kenyans and they don't realize, like, in terms of active social media usage in general, we are leading the world. Usage. Not number of users, but usage. Wild, right? Little old Kenya. That's why we were the first country where a president had to go on Twitter and congregate with people and say, I am listening. First country. Before Trump, there was Ruto, which is, I guess, indicative of a lot of things. But anyway, the point I'm getting at is, and also ties to the politics thing, but anyway, the point I'm getting at is that we have that mentality and we've had that kind of urge to be able to lead the charge on how this is being. So like the case studies I'm going to give, some of them are global, a lot of them are local, because in many ways, things happen here first. A lot of things happen here in Kenya and then we notice them later down the line. Now, how this ties to crises and how we manage them, I think, is a little bit nuanced because you have to look at the evolution of social movements separately from the evolution of the platforms themselves, right? So we've talked about this is how the evolution of brands communicating with their audiences went. We've also talked about how the platforms reacted to that change. What we didn't quite factor in is how the audience responded. And what basically happened is that as brands got greedier, and platforms got greedier, the audience changed. And that's where I want to introduce the people that we also need to give one clap for, yeah? Those kids that came in and decided that, no, this doesn't work. That's one clap, just 1, 2, 3 for Gen Z. 1, 2, 3. Because they fixed things. They changed things. They actually came and held platforms to account when millennials didn't. They came in and created movements that we couldn't. Because let's be realistic. Could millennials have pulled off this reject thing in like 10 days? From the first tweet, where's Mark? He's not yet here. From the first tweet of reject finance bill, one person with less than 300 followers tweeted reject finance bill, to the first protest was less than a week. That went that quickly. These are people who are about that action. Am I using the terminology right? Yeah? Okay, cool, thank you. So you have to look at them and understand that there's a lot of different things going on with them that makes them that active, makes them that big of agents of change. Because one, they're quite individualistic. They don't have that space that we had to play with each other as kids and connect with each other. They connect online. And when they connect online, that means that domain becomes how they build their connections. So things that we look at like, we need to get into a room together so that we can be able to do things faster, they can do them a lot faster online. Which, if you think about it, is technically a superpower. Because we don't know how to organize online. In fact, we look at them online and we go, these people are unorganized. But remember, from tweet 1 to protest 1 was less than a week. That was without organization by our standards. We don't understand it, and I'm kind of happy at least that when I say we, I feel like I'm not alone, yeah? See, millennials tuko. Okay, cool. No, I saw one in the back. When I said about that action, he nodded. and the other ones were, yeah. I'm also Gen Z, by the way. I don't know. No? I gave away with the 20 years of experience. Okay, cool. So, so there's that speed and that thing that comes from them knowing how to use the platforms and how to be natives on that platform. There's the way they know how to amplify each other's messages. I think there's something about how that one person with 300 followers was able to go from tweeting it to getting someone else to go and give him numbers of the MPs that voted for this and then sharing that under it and building something together. No shade, but we are not good at doing things together online. You want the glow for yourself. People will sooner download your tweet and share the image when they're millennials than retweet you, which is like weird. I don't understand what that is about. Just give someone the shine. We're not good at doing that, and they are very, very good at doing that. The other thing that you have to keep in mind is like these people are battle tested because they came up in the hardest of times. I realize this might be a hot take because some of us have very strong feelings about Gen Z. So please, for a second, bear with me as I objectively state that they have had it harder than the rest of us across the board. Fewer jobs, worse economies. If you think about the person who is 25 right now, when they were a child, there was post-election violence, and when they were finishing high school, there was COVID. That is the person you're talking about. That is the person who hears Ruto saying, I'm going to increase taxes. That's not us. Those are people who have had fire in their veins for so long. And every single time they've had it, they are always told, but you're so privileged. You have all these things that make your life so much easier. When I was young, there was no Wikipedia. They've sat there and watched you and said, sour, let's show you what online can do. These are the people who have come in and taken the things that matter to them and changed that dynamic. When we go back here and we talk about what these guys thought was possible, they did not think Gen Z was possible. That's why I forced you guys to clap for them. But I want to focus on these three things down here because they're the ones who kind of bring the values in. When you look at any poll that was done, again, I wish Mark was here because he's the one who did the Gen Z study. Although Odipo did one as well, yeah? one of the key things about them is they are very big on values. They're very, very big on purposefulness, meaningfulness. All of these things are huge for them. I don't have the exact numbers, but Patricia probably does. I'm putting pressure on her. So if you see her, the lovely lady with the blonde braids over there, please disturb her. But they're very big on that. Ethics matter. The quality of life matters. Second thing is they're very aware. Everything you think you know about them, they know, and then they know why you know it. So you have to be very aware that these people are very aware. And then the third thing is, like I said earlier, they're about that action. Got the cosign from a younger guy over there. Yeah? Still good? Still relevant. Okay, cool. What that means is they stand on business. Still using it right, yeah? Yeah. They do. And they expect us to do the same. Remember that thing I talked about, expectations? Now, they outnumber us by far, and what that has done is that it's created new crises that could not have existed before. I'm going to give you a few case studies. I'm going to try and be prompt about them, so don't expect like massive slides with lots of images. I just want to kind of talk you through them. So I'm going to jump quickly into these case studies. They're split into 4. And you here, by the way, is you guys. I've stopped talking about Gen Z. This is now about you guys. And specifically, the organizations, the brands, etc. Right? A few key things. We're going to talk about why actions, what you do, matters, because a lot of times we think of crisis in a very different way than kind of the actions that they look at. And what I want you to notice as we're going through these case studies is where these things happen, what triggers them. Because you'll realize very quickly that some of them are not tied to product performance or service delivery, but tied to emotions and values and sentiment, right? So actions matter, your business matters. So what you do behind the scenes that you think is nobody's business, that matters. There's nobody too big to fail. They have destroyed that myth infinitely, and there's no middle ground. Stand where you stand and stand there forever. Yeah, I mean, you can change, but there's rules to change. That's about change management. I want to touch on what happened to Safaricom during the reject movement. And this is a screenshot from Nendo and the report they did, which I really, really encourage you to go check it out. So it's down there, Occupy Brands. Basically, if you remember at some point during the protests, several things came up about Safcom. First one was that they were sharing data and helping the ops, as it were, track protesters. Second one was around shutting down the internet at key points, very pivotal moments. And you'll see those spikes over here. You can see that red line, that's the negative. And those are the dates, by the way. So that's from 6th May going until 12th of August. And a few key things to note here is that these moments were reacted to so quickly. Like, look at how severe that spike is, going from a non-issue to an issue. But the thing to also note here, which is kind of important, is at this point, this green indicates positive sentiment, that red is negative, and that lighter red there is still negative. Less negative, yeah, but still negative. We're looking at the percentage of negative comments over time. Even after the crisis passed, the sentiment didn't. And this is something to note that, yes, ties to the generational thing, but also ties to the platform and the medium. Because once you have destroyed that trust, rebuilding it, when we're talking about the phases of crisis management, rebuilding it is a very, very different story. Because that history lives on in the same exact space as you're trying to rebuild it. That archival history of people saying that Githurai is currently going through this, and we can't talk about it because Safcom has shut down the internet, is forever there. Recovering from this is a whole different spectrum than existed before. And when I was talking about what this evolution means, what this generation that stands on their values, and what these platforms that incentivize this level of tension what it does for your brand, you can see in just how that recovery didn't happen before. In our times, we had multiple movements. And maybe it's because we were busy, or maybe it's just because of how we were brought up. But we forgot them. This is not the first time Safaricom has been under fire. During our time, there are people who remember when we were on Twitter making noise about Safaricom 3 times a year, 4 times a year, 5 times a year. And we all still had 2 Safaricom lines, one for M-Pesa and then the other one for life. And that maintained. These guys were talking about getting off of Safcom. Starlink had a massive boost during this time. Airtel, for the first time in God knows how long, was trending. I'm sure they were sitting there looking at their ad spend saying, what? People who work on Airtel, I won't point out people. But anyway, people who worked on Airtel, I think the challenge that you have trying to gain share of voice against Safaricom. And in this one case, they had it. Now, their problem was a bit different. This is why I'm not using them as a success story, because the minute people started talking about internet, they ended up talking about the internet not being reliable on Airtel. But the point being that this moment created a problem that I am sure Safaricom thought they were too big to ever have to deal with. And a lot of that went down to, you think you can do something and people not talk about it. The leak came from inside Safaricom. The information was coming from inside. There were people sitting there whose values mattered more to them than their jobs. And they were like, fire me and see what else I'll do. That's the people that you're talking about, because crisis doesn't happen because of things, it happens because of people. And yes, the actions matter, but the thing that starts it is always that one tweet. It's always that one guy who decides to put it out there. And how many people follow him. Not in terms of numbers, but in terms of you just need 100 people for something to go viral. And on average, Kenyans have several hundred followers. You just need 100 of them to look at it and say, wow, and then share it. You're good. And this is what happened there. One person said, we have been instructed to, I don't know if you saw that tweet, but there was one person who talked about the things they were being told to do at Safcom. And they were told to take it down, obviously, because Safcom are quick about that business. They will catch you when you tweet it and we will find you. But it just took that one moment. And spark started, fire went on, and 2 million tweets later, this is where we are. Another thing that happened, and this is more on the flip side in terms of actions, is what happened with Java. Java opened their doors to protesters in the beginning. I talk about this as well if you watch any of my videos, but they opened their doors to protesters and the love grew. There's a tweet here, which even me, I can't read, but basically what it says is, we need to organize so that we can go there and buy everything they have, buy their entire stock, because these guys support us. Look at that volume of positivity over there. That big yellow band that you see there. More tweets also than the Safaricom one. Because again, for a lot of times people think that negativity sells. For them, actions matter. And that positive glean was a lot. Let's talk about business mattering. The things that you do behind the scenes. There was this iPhone 16 boycott that happened, which you might not know about, because some of us are Android people, or some of us just don't have iPhone 16 moolah sitting on the side. But there was a very real iPhone 16 boycott that took place, and this was in response to what's happening in Congo. And for as much as even this was not a very significant movement, it still had significant business impact for them. It had such a significant impact that you can tell the new articles that have come up about their financial performance were written by PR people, because for the PR guys, when you see the same headline repeated 10 times, press release, paid articles, etc. They have had to bury the impact of this, but in reality, when you look at the actual numbers, the iPhone 16's first week sales were 14% lower than the iPhone 15's first week sales. From a tiny, there are other reasons obviously, but a tiny movement that sparked that. people actually organizing and saying, we're not going to stand for this because we know where you get your precious metals from, we know where you get your chips from, we know where you get your cobalt from, and whatever other PR you're doing, you're still not saying anything about this, right? You can tell by my pin that I had to address this because BDS, which is basically the movement that's boycotting any business that supports Israeli action, and the current occupation and apartheid, has had such a massive impact for businesses. Starbucks had to fire their CEO because sales slumped so badly. They shut down in multiple countries. I don't know if you knew about this, but like Malaysia had such a massive drop in footfall. A bunch of airports, people were just straight up not going to the Starbucks anymore or protesting while they were waiting for their flights. It became such a global impact that at some point they issued a statement, like it was a really weak statement, but they still issued a statement. And I want to highlight the fact that their boss was removed because the initial cause of Starbucks being boycotted was the boss, because he had made very pro-Israel statements. And that alone led to this movement that led to a company worth billions losing billions. I think it was like 4-point-something billion. They had back-to-back 3 of their worst quarters in the last 10 years. So massive, massive impact. McDonald's as well, 7 billion lost. I think they shut down, I can't remember what the number of branches was, but they fired somewhere around 5,000 people in the Middle East alone. All of this coming from a social movement that turned into an internal crisis because people refused to take a stand or took the wrong stand. If you are left-leaning in terms of political ideology, so you're more liberal, and you are pro-life in terms of like the stance on abortion, right? That is ideologically a wrong stand. If you're right-leaning and you're pro-choice, that is ideologically a wrong stand. The thing that determines whether or not the stand is right for you is how far from where you stand is what you believe. So if I am standing here and telling you, Gen Zs, and then I go out there and I never hire a single Gen Z in my company, that is wrong. And that's where the stand comes in. Like what you say, what you do, and what you believe have to align. No Goliath is too big. I'm going to touch on this really quickly just because she's a friend of Converge, and she is currently, her name is Mercy Mutemi. She's currently the first lawyer to successfully litigate against Meta twice, 2 separate cases. First is this one. Is it twice or 3 times? I think it's 2 cases that have gone through, yeah? First one is this one, where Meta was, like I mentioned, playing with politics, and a lawyer in Kenya, youngish lawyer, younger than me for sure, decided to take it up as their cause. And this is what has happened. They are now currently in court for 1.6 billion in damages. Likewise, she took up the case for content moderators in Kenya. Again, Meta, who has not successfully been litigated against anywhere else in the world, there is one Kenyan lawyer who is holding them right now by the neck. You might think about crisis in terms of volume and noise, but something like this is so critical to what Meta does in the future that they actually have had to allocate resources like never before. Because that 1.6 does not matter how rich you are. That's a number you don't want to lose. So they went from acting like this isn't a thing. I think if you ever saw their first response, so basically like, we're not a registered company in Kenya, you can't do anything about us. They sent it by mail. Now they have a team set up here just for legal. Okay, I hope no one from Meta is here. Anyway, so that's the same thing applies to political giants. I mentioned earlier, like the Israel thing. Israel spends more money on PR, by the way, than almost anything else. But if you look at the volume of negative media they have right now, you can't compete with a social movement that has taken root, right? You can't outbuy it. You can't outspend it because the factors are just going to be against you. The last one, I think, is we talked about the middle ground. So still on the Israel thing, the flip-flopping, where we had Zucchini just before Ramadan saying, yay, we are pro-Palestine. And then they still continued selling products. And one person mentioned, they haven't destocked the products. And a movement of people started taking letters to them. And to this day, they are still on the boycott list, where anybody who is pro does not shop there. Anyone who is pro-Palestine does not shop at Zucchini. And a lot of this just has to do with the flip-flopping. If they had stayed quiet, just think about this for a second. If they had not said, we are pro-Palestine, there are people who would have still shopped there. But the fact that you put yourself on that stand and took a stand and said, I am here, and then your actions were over here, meant that you can't backtrack. You can't be like, oops, sorry, my bad. There's no coming back from it. Even when they destock, it doesn't matter. This is what exists now, right? But the short of color washing is just people who pretend they have values that they don't actually have. So like greenwashing is those guys who say, Happy Environment Day, and then they go and create a car with a 6-liter engine. Or Shell, who started this program for clean energy futures that was basically a fuel plant. These things will get called out a lot more now and will turn into real movements because people have those real values and they have them in volume, right? So what can we learn from this? How do we ensure our brands don't lose value in these crises? I want to give 3 big takeaways. The first one is you have to secure your core value. Yeah? Take a stand, plant a flag. Exactly what she said. You have to decide where that is for you and how far down that pipeline you are. If you say, I am pro this, but I'm not going to be vocal about it, that's still a stand. Versus if you say, I'm going to make this my cause and I'm going to ride for it, that is also a stand, right? Java didn't put up posts saying reject finance bill. They opened the door and then they closed it when the cops came. Didn't spend any media money, didn't do anything, but they still took a stand. So you have to decide where your stand is, where your flag is, and stand there. Because even after they got all that positive light, I don't think they ever made a statement about it. Second thing is consistent transparency. Transparency, by the way, is no longer an option. People will see through you one way or another, whether you like it or not. But you have to be able to sustain that. You have to be able to know what people can see and make sure you say it before they see it. And be consistent about it. This also means if you mess up, be the first person to say you messed up. But I don't shed light on anybody, but very recently there's been instances of people having to say, oh, this happened. Actually, there's a case study in somebody's presentation about people who owned up to something before it happened, or before it kind of got out there, so it would simmer down a little bit. And this is important about just being consistent with that transparency. Build a culture of people trusting you to be there to say what you stand for, what you believe in, and what you're about. Because that trust goes a long way. And then the third one is just talk about it and be about it. Once you've decided where you are, what you mean, how far down that pipeline you go, and you create frameworks to be able to consistently push that message out, talk about it, be about it. Follow through with the action, right? So there's a book, if any of you are book people, it's a digital book about crisis management. I will send this in the emailer. But they basically talk about how we need to go back to the idea of communicating like ancient times. And the main reason for this is we've now hit the point where you can have 1 million people, but those 1 million people behave like a baraza. It's like a small village. We are all just here next to each other. So your tactics shouldn't be podium, stadium. You're not talking to the audience, you're talking with them. If you say something, they can say something back faster than you. So we have to go back to that idea of how do you communicate with people. Leaders have to be more accessible. People have to be more direct with what they're doing. And that's kind of where my whole push for like being value-based comes in. Because when we go back to the phases of how crisis is managed, and you take those ideas I've been mentioning, I've sorted them out for you guys so that you don't have to do the notes. For preparedness, it means identifying your community, building within that community equity and credibility through your actions, through your words, through everything you do. In response, when you're responding to these things, you then respond to your community, right? There is a correct way to do that. Start with the people closest, because those are the people who will amplify. Show your values, show your commitment. Because if you have this already built, You're not saying something new. You're showing what's been there. And if you think about it from the standpoint of what a crisis is, that unexpectedness and unpreparedness goes away when you've already made your stand known, when you've already taken a position. So if part of your position is we do not talk politics, that can be a position. We don't talk politics, but you make it clear. And when something political happens and someone comes to you and says, hey, stand chat, why haven't you? You can sit there quietly and nobody's going to question you. But you have to have made that stand known beforehand, right? And then from there in recovery, it's about growing that community. Because the people who believed in you when you said it before will believe in you afterwards. And that's where you grow, you deepen that value, you deepen that commitment. Now, there's a framework here that I like to push, but again, if you want in-depth strategies, please give me a call later, which is essentially just around building value-based strategies with tact, right? So one, you want to govern the thoughts that kind of come out of things, and you do that through beliefs and values. You want to look at action and the actions that you take. So look at what are the norms in terms of how your brand behaves, how your organization behaves, what are the standards in terms of how you do things. Norms, by the way, is where the extent comes in. Because norms, for example, can be that you guys are frequently outlandish. And that goes into that side where some people might be turned off by it. But norms also go into the area that's kind of looked at as mores, which are things that are just, those things that are slightly normal, slightly abnormal, right? So think of it like this way. There are some things that if people do, you might not be okay with. If everybody walks into an elevator, what do you do when you walk in? You walk in and then you turn and face the door, right? If someone walked in and just faced the back, is there anything wrong they're doing? But you would feel awkward standing around them, right? You have to be aware of what the norms of your community are, from the very small things to the very big things, and be able to make sure you don't end up on the wrong side of the elevator, right? Because like on the flip side, if they showed up without pants, but they faced the right way, that's still very weird. You can't just stand there, right? So there's some things you have to look at, like what are the behaviors that are expected? What is the action that is expected from my community for the stand that I'm taking? Communication goes into language and symbols. A good example of this is Apple, who are very openly inclusive. I say openly inclusive. They don't make statements about it. They're just openly inclusive. You will see rainbow symbols everywhere. You never see the word LGBTQ. Pro-love, but you never see the word love. Symbols matter. What you show matters. If you show peace and children and whatnot, people expect something from that. So you have to be very aware of that. And then the last one is the touch points. So that's where tact comes in, because touch points, tactile. But also the acronym. The idea that you have to find the experiences and spaces that people expect you to be in and be there. This counts especially during social movements, because if you are about that life and a protest is happening and you're not present, that matters. If you really say that you're about something and you don't follow through where it matters the most, then people will hold you to it. So really it's connecting with your community through their culture and through very clear communication. There's a whole framework around this. Very happy to share it with any of you if you have the need to. But now I'll just say thank you very much for listening.